Chapter 4. The Borot'bism under the Hetmanate. Ukrainian political life during the Hetmanate was in part conducted underground. This was especially true of the Upsr and of all peasant organizations. Revolution had brought radical changes in the agrarian life of the country, the abolition of private ownership of land and the partition, in some measure, of the large landed estates. By dissolving all land committees and restoring the right of ownership and sale of land, the Skoropadsky regime re-established pre-revolutionary conditions. A. Worker and peasant opposition to the Hetman coup. 1. The Second All-Ukrainian Peasants' Congress. The proclamation of April 29, 1918 by the Hetmanate was coolly received by the masses and by practically all Ukrainian political parties. Opposition was registered at the Second All-Ukraine Peasants' Congress, which convened illegally in the Holosiv forest near Kyiv, May 8 to 10. Despite the arrest of many delegates en route to the Congress, more than 12,000 delegates from virtually all villages in Ukraine gathered at the Congress, in which the Ukrainian SRs played a prominent role. The Congress resolved number 1, not to recognize the Hetman regime, number 2, to demand the restoration of the Ukrainian People's Republic, number 3, to appeal to the German people and their government to support the Ukrainian claims, number 4, to demand the convocation of the Ukrainian Constituent Assembly, number 5, to form local armed groups which would, upon instructions from the center, start an uprising, and number 6, to appeal to the workers and democratic organizations in Ukraine to unite with the peasants in support of the aims of the revolution. The proclamation to the Ukrainian peasantry, which the Congress distributed illegally in hundreds of thousands of copies, read, Brother peasants, land and freedom are in peril. A black cloud has spread over our land and would keep the peasants in poverty and ignorance. Let us all rise up against counter-revolution. We will die, but we will not surrender our land and freedom. 2. The Second All-Ukrainian Workers' Congress. The Second All-Ukrainian Workers' Congress convened also illegally in Kyiv, May 13 to 14. The majority of the delegates were representatives of Russian and Jewish workers. The Congress adopted a series of resolutions which advocated number 1, the restoration of the Ukrainian People's Republic, number 2, the creation of a Ukrainian Constituent Assembly, number 3, the transfer of the land to the people without compensation to owners, number 4, the institution of an 8-hour working day and workers' control over production, number 5, the guarantee of all liberties proclaimed by the Third and Fourth Universals, and number 6, the equality of all nationalities in Ukraine. The Congress declared that the Hetmanate was the beginning of a struggle by the world bourgeoisie against the revolutionary aspirations of the working masses of the whole world. Suppression of revolution in Ukraine will be followed by suppression of revolution in Russia. The proposal of the Bolshevik delegates to call on the workers to fight for the establishment of a Soviet Ukraine, however, was rejected by the Congress. Robitnitsha Gazeta, Workers' Gazette, the USDRP's organ in Kyiv, heralded the Congress as the first united demonstration of the Proletariat of Ukraine, which refused to orient itself toward Moscow and Petrograd and declared itself in favor of the Ukrainian People's Republic. The question arises, why did the Russian Mensheviks and Jewish Bundists at the Congress vote for an independent Ukraine? The Russian cadets, constitutional Democrats, and other rightist parties which supported the Hetmanate spoke openly at their own party congress of the temporary nature of Ukrainian statehood. The answer lies in the fact that an independent Ukraine had by this time become an integral part of the revolution. The Second Workers' Congress certainly would not have supported this idea had it not felt compelled to recognize the demand for the existence of a Ukrainian state. B. The Fourth Congress of the UPSR and the split. 1. The Fourth Congress. The Fourth Congress of the UPSR, the last Congress of the still united Ukrainian SRs, convened illegally in the vicinity of Kyiv, May 13 to 16. Because many of the party's leaders were under arrest or in hiding, only 34 or 35 delegates were able to assemble. The agenda for the Congress included number 1, reports from the party group in the Central Rada and from the party Central Committee, number 2, the current situation, and 3, party tactics. According to Shapoval, a participant in the debates of the first 2 days, there were 3 openly hostile groups at the Congress. During the first 2 days, there were reports, debates, and resolutions. The discussion of the question of whether the Rada could be regarded as an organ of revolution was especially heated. The left was already disposed to follow the Bolshevik line. It repudiated the Rada and proposed a resolution which condemned it in the strongest terms. However, the majority voted for the resolution of the center. The right supported the center. The resolution criticized the Rada but did not reject it. The new Central Committee was elected on the third day because some of the delegates of the right and the center were absent, and because some of the members of the center were included in the list of the left. A paradox occurred. The list presented by the left received a majority by 1 or 2 votes. Thus, the Central Committee fell into the hands of the latter. Asked whether the Central Committee would follow the directives indicated in the resolutions, the new men of the Central Committee gleefully replied that they would not. That response prompted the center to declare that they were creating a separate faction of their own within the UPSR. The split was a fait accompli. Thus, the largest revolutionary party of Ukraine was destroyed only a year after its constituent assembly. The differentiation which Shapoval made between a center and a right wing was not manifest, according to Christiuk, until after the Congress. Christiuk, the major source for the Congress, speaks only of a division into a left and a right wing, each of which was almost equally represented. The representatives of the right wing insisted that the breathing space offered by the hetmanate should be used to organize the masses and raise their cultural level and their class and national consciousness. Motivated by a desire to preserve the Ukrainian state as one of the greatest gains of the revolution, they favored participation in the future parliament, state council. If one were to be convened by the hetman and believed that the UPSR should collaborate with the USDRP and the UPSF for the purpose of placing the government in Ukrainian hands. The left-wing delegates, on the other hand, regarding the revolution as incomplete, stressed the importance of its social and economic aspects. They protested the national state-minded and evolutionary policy of the party's right wing and the undermining of the class struggle by the non-political and cultural work of the party heads. To prepare the peasants and workers for an uprising against the Hetman regime, they called for a party underground organization. The following excerpts from speeches delivered by members of the left wing anticipate the split that was to rend the party following the Congress. To protect their identity, the speakers were referred to by numbers. Comrade 6. The present state of affairs is the result of the policy of the Central Committee and the government. The hetmanate is a further outgrowth of that policy. And following the road of unity which counter-revolutionaries in the Rada, the UPSR has brought about the downfall of the government of the moderate parties. It is with this in mind that we must judge the present situation. 2 irreconcilable wings have developed within the UPSR. The first was pro-German, the second, if it had had the troops, would have fought the first. To criticize the government was not enough, it should have been destroyed by armed forces. The government was supported by all but its own people. The name Socialist Revolutionary was adopted by persons other than Socialist Revolutionaries. When comrades say that we must establish a democratic bourgeois republic, this clearly characterizes that wing. We must separate. In matters of tactics, perhaps we'll agree with the right wing, but our presuppositions and our psychology are different. It is clear that one or the other must leave the party. Comrade 17. The principal reasons for the bankruptcy and weakness of the party lies in the fact that it is not socialistic. Those who stood for merely a national revolution have joined it. Under the banner of the party, they joined the Rada government to establish Realpolitik. Those who summoned the Germans were little interested in the revolution. They stifled the revolution and have delayed its outbreak in Germany. They wanted to save the state at any price. Social issues were of secondary importance. Now they are ready immediately to abandon the demand for socialization of the land. We are now divided into 2 groups, the internationalists and the statists. We are not against the German people. We are simply against the policy of the present government. Comrade 18. We have 2 trends in our party, the revolutionary and the evolutionary. The latter is revolutionary only in the nationalist sense. This is evident from its work both in the government and in the Rada. All this obscures the class struggle. In those organizations which remain legal, we should work legally, but at the same time we should also develop revolutionary activity. Our principal work will be done underground. Because of the division of the Congress into left and right, each wing offered a resolution on the present situation, tactics, and appraisal of the past activity of the party. The resolution proposed by the right wing stressed the following points. Number 1. In the past revolutionary year, some of the demands of the party have been realized. The party has found strong support in the revolutionary enthusiasm of the masses, yet the fact that the party relied mainly on revolutionary enthusiasm was also its weakness. For when the revolutionary enthusiasm of the masses began to subside, it became clear that the party lacked other, more stable foundations, which would enable it to remain the leader of the masses and at the same time check the triumphant course of reaction and moderate the ebbing of the revolutionary wave. 2. The Hetman coup of April 29 does not reflect the configuration of the social forces in the country. From the point of view of social evolution, it is abnormal. Power has been usurped by elements which have no support in the country. Therefore, one of the current tasks of party tactics is the fight for the democratization of political and social life in Ukraine. 3. The period of political stagnation should be utilized to strengthen the party so that at the earliest reappearance of the revolutionary wave, the party will emerge better prepared and stronger. These tactics should apply equally to national and social policy, since the turn of events in Ukraine represents a threat to both the national and the social gains of the Ukrainian revolution. The resolution proposed by the left wing, the future Borot'bisty, was the first document in which they clearly formulated their position. 1. The Fourth Congress of the Ukrainian Party of Socialist Revolutionaries takes cognizance of the fact that since the last Third Party Congress, the Central Committee, the parliamentary representatives and the party members who participated in the Rada government have deviated from the path which was clearly defined by the ideological program, the tactical postulates of the party, and the very foundation of international socialism. As a result, the party has become ideologically bankrupt and has abetted counter-revolution in Ukraine. Having lost popularity among the masses, the party has completely discredited its name. 2. Recognizing that the toiling peasants and the workers of Ukraine, deprived of their gains, should continue to marshal their forces to the final victory over reaction, and hoping that the revolutionary movement in Ukraine as an organized force will become an integral part of the world revolutionary movement, the Congress recommends A. Initiating a wide campaign among the masses in order to prevent spontaneous outbreaks by the people, which weaken the revolutionary forces of democracy. B. Granting priority to an active organized struggle in the tradition of socialist revolutionaries. C. Disassociating the party clearly from all socialist and non-socialist political trends in Ukraine, which by following a conciliatory policy obscured the tasks of class struggle. D. Striving unswervingly for the consolidation of all revolutionary socialist forces in order to achieve the final victory of socialism through class struggle. The resolution offered by the right wing received a slight majority. The draft resolution on the land question advocated abandonment of the policy of socialization and proposed instead the land be granted to the peasants for their lifetime and their posterity, but without right of sale. However, this resolution, together with the resolution of the past record of the Central Committee and the party's representatives in the Rada, failed to receive the necessary majority. Hristyuk believes that the victory of the left wing in the elections of the new Central Committee can be explained by the fluid composition of the Congress, a fact which was in turn the result of its conspiratorial nature. The members of the new Central Committee, according to Hristyuk, consisted almost exclusively of leaders of the left wing Levko Kovalyev, Andrei Zalivchey, Hnat Mikhailichenko, Arkady Prakhitko, Vyacheslav Lashkevich, and K. Korsh, a candidate. Mykola Shrach and the candidate Mykola Chechel were members of the right wing. Several weeks after the Congress, the Central Committee announced the dissolution of the UPSR, ignoring the resolutions which had just been approved. From then on, the party existed only illegally. The party newspaper, Borot'ba, Struggle, previously a daily, became an underground weekly. The members of the left wing of the UPSR eventually became known, therefore, as Borot'bisty, that is, supporters of Borot'ba. In the new party registration, the Central Committee accepted members only from the left wing. It is true that a new registration was long overdue. In 1917, membership in the UPSR had numbered more than 1 million, but this was largely a paper membership. The majority had registered collectively during mass political meetings. To have left the party in such a state of unchecked and uncontrolled mass membership during the Hetmanate would have exposed it to dangerous provocation. 2. Aftermath of the Congress. Opposition of the non-left. The opposition to the left-controlled Central Committee announced the formation of a provisional organizational committee of the central faction, which included Shirach, who withdrew from the new Central Committee. Chechel, Saltan, Ivan Lezanievsky, Volodymyr Zalizniak, Holubovich, and Okremovich. The central faction addressed the following declaration to all party members. As is well known, there has existed in the party for some time a wing which has called itself Internationalist, or simply left-bank men. This was a small group which had its strongholds chiefly in some towns in Poltava and Kharkiv provinces. The ideology of this group differed and differs in many respects from the basic ideology of the party. This was particularly evident with respect to the idea of creating a state. While the majority of the party believes that the national liberation of the Ukrainian people through the creation of an independent Ukrainian state is a necessary prerequisite for the success of their struggle for social and political liberation, the aforementioned group has underestimated the problem of the national state regarding the idea of Ukrainian but not Russian statehood, more or less as both factions of the Russian socialist revolutionaries have regarded and still do regard it. This was the first fundamental difference. Another point of difference lay in the understanding of the methods of class and mass struggle. While in the opinion of the majority of the party, the best method was the political and professional organization and education of the masses and an organized struggle over a long period of time, regardless of whether the revolution was advancing or receding. The aforementioned group paid little attention to work among the masses and emphasized insurrectional tactics exclusively. By way of analogy, it might be said that the majority of the party approximated the position of European socialism, while the above-mentioned group was close to the position of Russian Bolshevism. In this connection, the group showed great reluctance to accept any minimum program, while the elements which today compose the central faction of the UPSR have always defended the view that the party program must be realized by both revolutionary struggle and evolutionary activity. Therefore, a minimum program and its gradual realization cannot be regarded as incompatible. These were and still are our main differences. The declaration went on to announce that, because it had been impossible to overcome these differences at the Fourth Congress, the party had split into two equal factions. The newly elected Central Committee had placed the party in an extremely difficult position, hence the need arose to create a center composed of all who did not share the former's views. The declaration further asserted that it was necessary, once for all, to clarify the problem as to whether our party should end the class struggle, adopt the methods of European socialism, or follow the road of Russian anarchic insurrectionism. It closed with an expression of confidence that the majority of the party would join the central faction and that at the next party congress this action would be confirmed. The left-controlled Central Committee responded to this declaration by resolving, number 1, to consider the creation of a central faction as inadmissible, and number 2, to forbid party members from participating in its formation. The tone of the resolution was that of a different party. Whether or not final victory would lie with the left wing or with the central faction hinged on the political situation of the moment. The course of events indicated a definite tendency toward the left, toward agrarian revolution, which had been interrupted by the Hetman regime. The Hetman regime itself provoked a leftward reaction which threatened to unleash civil war. The growing wave of peasant discontent favored anarchic insurrectionism, not European socialism. It is not surprising, therefore, that not long after the split in the UPSR, the Borot'bistes acquired a large following, while the right wing of the old UPSR narrowed to a small circle of government elite. Even during the Fourth Congress, the Borot'bistes showed greater vitality than the right wing. While the Congress was compelled to move from one place to another, the Borot'bistes attended its sessions more regularly and were a more disciplined force than the right wing, and hence were successful at the critical moment, the election of the new Central Committee. They controlled the party apparatus at the Congress, for illegality and underground work were their forte. According to Shapoval, at the time of the party split, the leaders of the right wing were Mykola Kovalevsky, Holubovich, Sultan, and Sevryuk. Those of the center included Shapoval himself, Nikifor Hrigoryev, Lizanevsky, and Shrach. The right wing had been dominant during the period of the Central Rada. The center, despite the efforts of Shapoval and Hrigoryev during the period of the Directory, was never successful in playing a leading role, perhaps because Shapoval himself, like so many SRs, immigrated to the West very early. The split of Ukrainian society into legal and illegal camps. On May 24, four moderate Ukrainian parties, including even the Ukrainian Democratic Agrarian Party, which had actively supported the Hetman coup, sent a joint statement to the Hetman government protesting its anti-Ukrainian and anti-democratic policies. The regime was therefore forced to rely entirely on the support of the right Russian parties, the Cadets, and Monarchists, which in Ukraine represented the Russified upper stratum of society. Hence, the course of the regime was set to the right, despite the fact that the German authorities declared that the government should include the representatives of the Ukrainian socialists and should follow a leftist policy. The Hetman government and administration included many former Tsarist officials, from ministers at the top to members of the village police at the bottom. They offered their services as specialists, only too happy to leave insecure Petrograd for hospitable Kiev. The policy of the new Ukrainian state, the official title which superseded that of Ukrainian People's Republic, aimed at the destruction of the revolutionary gains. A strict censorship of the press was imposed, public meetings were restricted, strikes were banned, and the 8-hour day was abolished. A compulsory work program was introduced for urgent agricultural projects, which in practice meant that the peasants were forced to work on landed estates for wages established by special governmental commissions. State fixed prices for grain also hurt the peasants. The German occupation army despoiled the country of its agricultural produce and raw materials. The peasants were compelled to restore to the landed estates everything which they had seized during the revolution. To help the landowners collect the fines imposed against peasants who could not meet this demand, the Hetman government formed punitive detachments which terrorized villages and frequently executed peasants. According to records of the German General Staff, by the end of the summer more than 20,000 German soldiers had been lost in combating peasant uprisings. These drastic measures only accelerated the polarization of Ukrainian political life. Maistrenko offers the following characterization of the period. The Ukrainians were divided into two major camps, the legal and the illegal. The legal camp comprised all parties which had formerly been in the Central Rada, the SDs, SRs, SFs, independents, and other groups. The illegal camp included left Ukrainian SDs, independents, and left Ukrainian SRs who had broken away from their legal parties. They sharply criticized those SRs and SDs who had negotiated with the Germans, the Hetman government, and the Russian bourgeoisie. Unfortunately, the left camp was too weak to marshal Ukrainian democracy. The chief Ukrainian political leaders remained in the legal camp. In spite of the criticism leveled at them by their leftist comrades, they attempted to save whatever they could. The illegal camp held that real national sovereignty for Ukraine could be achieved only through social revolution. In their view, Ukraine could never become a bourgeois state because it lacked Ukrainian landowners and industrial capitalists. They accused the legal parties of siding with the Russian bourgeoisie since they supported the latter's protégé, the Hetman. The legal coup stood for the preservation of the Ukrainian state at any price. Later, the parties within this camp were to justify their revolt against the Hetmanate by the fact that the latter proclaimed the federation of Ukraine with Russia November 14, 1918, thus betraying the idea of Ukrainian independence. They regarded the collaboration of the Borot'bism with the Russian Bolsheviks, left SRs, and Anarchists as a national treason. In an attempt to Ukrainize the Hetman government and to control it from within, the legal Ukrainian opposition parties formed the Ukrainian National Union, Ukrainski Nationalny Soyuz, headed by Maistrenko. It was charged with the defense of Ukrainian independence, both at home and abroad, and the establishment of a parliamentary system of responsible government. It is noteworthy that such an opposition body existed only in Kiev. The German occupation army and the Hetman regime precluded a wide activity on the part of the National Union. In the provincial cities, especially where German troops were garrisoned, no such organizations were possible. On the other hand, the revolutionary mood of the oppressed peasantry tended to favor illegal parties, especially the Borot'bism, who, according to Christiuk, possessed the most effective political organization of the day. See the program of the Borot'bism. 1. The platform of the new Central Committee. One document from this period shows that the Borot'bisti to be ideologically a completely new political group, the platform of the Central Committee of the UPSR. Before presenting the main features of this platform, it will be useful to define some of the terminology current at this time. The term democracy in the vocabulary of the UPSR was used in the social and economic, not the political and constitutional sense. The democratic forces were the peasants and workers. Only those movements were democratic, which recognized the interests of the toiling masses. In Borot'bist documents, the term statehood was largely a negative concept, acquired under the influence of the Russian left Emissaries, the Anarchists, and perhaps too Drahomanov. However, it is important to emphasize that although artificial state boundaries, independence as the ultimate goal, and efforts to create national states, inevitably connected with imperialist tendencies, were condemned in Borot'bist publications, the right of Ukraine to equal partnership among states was taken for granted. The platform, having acknowledged the temporary triumph of counter-revolution in Ukraine, went on to analyze the reasons for this development. These were found to be 1. The absence of strong mass organizations in Kiev and throughout the country, 2. The one-sided nationalist policy of the Rada, which had delayed social reform and aroused suspicion among the peasants, thus adding fuel to Bolshevik propaganda, 3. The destructive Bolshevik war against Ukraine, which had demoralized the toiling masses, paved the way for separatist and nationalist tendencies and for collaboration with the Germans, and brought an end to revolutionary organizations in Ukraine. 4. The influence of the international bourgeoisie, in particular the German bourgeoisie, on the Hetman government. 5. The infamous alliance of the Hetman regime with German militarism, which was compromising the very idea of the Ukrainian liberation movement and the Ukrainian Socialist parties. And 6. The lack of support from international revolutionary socialist forces and the Second International. International reaction, the platform declared, in taking advantage of the military unpreparedness of the Ukrainian Republic and the weakness of its democratic organizations, has openly aided the bourgeoisie in their struggle against land and other reforms. This reaction, it was stated, aimed 1. To transform Ukraine into a colony, 2. To abrogate those rights secured by the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, 3. To transform the independent Ukrainian government into a dependency subservient to Berlin, and 4. To prevent a revolution in Germany. The platform expressed faith in the inevitable revolutionary solution to chaos in the world by international democracy. Yet, the success of the struggle which the toiling masses are waging for their political, national, and socio-economic liberation will be possible only if the struggle is supported by the politically mature democratic organizations in Ukraine and is conducted in close contact with the democracies of other countries to which Ukraine has been bound by the course of historical events. It is noteworthy that this Borot'bist pronouncement contains no regrets over the separation of Ukraine from Russia and makes no direct reference to Russian revolutionary movements. The platform expressed stated that in coordinating its work with international revolutionary democracy, the Central Committee would maintain the closest of ties with the socialist parties of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Great Russia, Poland, and other neighboring countries, and would inflexibly pursue class tactics. The Hetman regime was severely censored, yet at the same time the platform warned against premature and ill-organized peasant uprisings. As for the German occupation, the Central Committee would combat demagogic slogans which were calculated to stir national enmity and which called for an armed uprising against the Germans, but it would advocate a struggle on the domestic class front. The Central Committee was of the opinion that government by councils of workers and peasants deputies would be possible only for the short period of actual revolution, after which government should be transferred to local self-governing organs and to a central parliament, the first of which must be the Ukrainian Constituent Assembly. Finally, it was considered imperative that the Ukrainian Constituent Assembly be convened in the shortest possible time. 2. The weapon of terror. Appended to the platform was the Central Committee's resolution of June 3, 1918 on domestic tactics. In addition to dissolving all legal organizations of the party, The resolution sanctioned the use of terror against the most influential and most iniquitous representatives of reactionary despotism in the capital and in the periphery, as well as against the representatives of international counter-revolution in Ukraine. The resolution continued in the following words: "Political terror is germane to the view of revolutionary socialism concerning the role of the individual in history. It is justified by the recent revolutionary past and by present events. Systematic terror, together with other forms of mass demonstration, such as strikes, peasant unrest, and sabotage, is of enormous importance. It disorganizes the enemy. Moreover, terror aids propaganda and agitation. Being an open means of warfare, which is manifest before the eyes of all the people, it destroys the authority of the government and engenders new revolutionary forces. Finally, terrorist activity by an illegal revolutionary party is a means of self-defense and protection against harmful influences, spying and betrayal. Terrorist activity ceases only with victory over reactionary despotism and with the full restoration of all political and civil liberties." The phrase "terror is germane to the view of revolutionary socialism" was borrowed from the program of the Russian Ssrs. In 1918, the year of greatest terrorist activity throughout Russia, Russian right Ssrs assassinated Volodarsky and the Uritsky in Petrograd and attempted to assassinate Lenin in Moscow. To sabotage the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the Russian left Ssrs assassinated Count Mirbach, the German envoy in Moscow, and General Ehor, the commander-in-chief of the Germany in Ukraine. The Anarchists bombed the building of the Moscow City Committee of the Russian Communist Party, Bolshevik, killing several people, among them Barbara Yakovleva, the secretary of the Bolshevik Moscow Committee. The cult of terror evoked the revolutionary ardor and by the unruly and violent masses of demobilized soldiers was intensified in Ukraine by the severity of the German occupation and became an accepted part of the revolutionary times. The leaders of the UPSR Borot'bism, like the Russian left Ssrs and anarchists with whom they were closely allied, were also carried away by the wave of terror. Terror was glorified by the two Borot'bist poets Vasil Shumak, at the time 19 years old, and Vasil Blakitny, a member of the Central Committee. It is therefore understandable that the Borot'bist, unlike the right wing of the UPSR, did not participate in reformist institutions such as the National Union and the Zemstvos. A few months of the Hetman regime was sufficient to deepen considerably the gulf between left and right Ukrainian Ssrs. It was in this period that the Borot'bist severed all ties with Ukrainian parliamentary democracy, never to re-establish them. 3. The national question. While the right wing of Ukrainian democracy sought to compromise with the Hetmanate and the Germans, the Borot'bist attempted to establish contact with revolutionary socialist groups in Europe, especially in Germany. They believed that world revolution was at hand and, wrapped in their apocalyptic visions, had no time for the prosaic endeavors by the Ukrainian liberal and right socialist groups to bring about the democratization of the Hetman regime. The position of the Borot'bist was clearly evident in an article entitled Appeasers, published in their underground organ Borot'ba in August 1918. The article discussed a recent memorandum of the Zemstvos to the Hetman, which pleaded with the government to protect democracy and the Ukrainian nation. The Zemstvos were led primarily by moderate socialists, the most active of whom was Simon Petlura. The gentlemen of the Zemstvo have forgotten just one thing. The Borot'bist declared that Mr. Hetman is a usurper and a tool of the Black Hundred, a mortal enemy of the Ukrainian people. If they have forgotten, then they are simply prepared to make a pact with the devil himself and to aid reaction. The second issue of Borot'ba carried a long article entitled The Ukrainian National Union, which offered the discussion of the party point of view on the problem of the nation and the state. During World War, at a time when the supremacy of the bourgeoisie is threatened by revolution, the best means of defense of the status quo against the growth of socialist action is the involvement of the working people in all kinds of national statist orientations. Among the great power nations, the function of such disruptive tactics has been performed by various theories of historic missions, racial destinies, etc., as well as by pseudo-liberating slogans which have screened the aggressive and imperialist intentions of those powers. Among the smaller, the non-historic nations, the bourgeoisie painstakingly spread and supports separatist and independent tendencies and inculcate into the masses the desire to build national states, a desire which is not only foreign, but hostile to the independent class policy of the proletariat. The various illusions of the proletariat, which are linked with the growth and strengthening of the national state, led to the worst kind of opportunism, to collaboration between classes, and to an unnatural unification of the national state front, which allows the dominant class to appease the revolutionary spirit of the people by means of insignificant reforms, thus restraining them from carrying out a wide and planned struggle for the complete transformation of the present social structure. However, social concessions, the complete liquidation of revolutionary efforts, and the substitution of civil peace for the class struggle do not ameliorate the national problem. National oppression is detrimental to the masses not only because civil liberties are destroyed in an atmosphere of national restrictions, but above all because it keeps the people in ignorance, prevents the development of class consciousness, and diverts the attention of the masses from the cause of all enslavement, social inequality. In the fight by oppressed people for their total liberation, the national justice, the political struggle, must therefore be regarded as a means to an end and must not replace the class struggle. All the more inadmissible is the substitution of a national struggle for the ultimate goal, the institution of a socialist order in which alone the realization of full and total sovereign freedom is possible. At a time when the consciousness of national injustice must play the role of a revolutionary agent, bourgeois politicians with all their efforts are propelling the proletariat toward a statist ideology, deceiving it with promises of national liberation through the creation of a national state. The enthusiasm shown for the slogans of national statehood destroys the solidarity of international toiling democracy and substitutes the conservative slogan of the state for the revolutionary idea of the nation, thus giving the national bourgeoisie a monopoly in the exploitation of the masses within the country and in an imperialist aggressive policy abroad. The state was and is the instrument of this exploitation, the means of subjugation of the majority by the minority, and the centralized national state even more so than the federative. Therefore, socialist policy must strive to win back step by step the recognition of the rights of national collectives and to endow them with an important share of the functions of a modern state until their transformation into a federation of autonomous national personal extraterritorial alliances, personalnych exterritorialnych spilok. Having set forth this theory, the article continued with an attack on the national union. Our understanding of the national problem, dictated by the fundamental postulates of international revolutionary socialism, draws a sharp line between the UPSR on the one hand and the national democratic bourgeois and pseudo-socialist parties and organizations which make up the so-called Ukrainian National Union on the other. Both the naked idea of creating a strong independent Ukrainian state, incorporated in the statute of the Union, concealed only by the fig leaf of commercial liberalism, and the tactics of the Union, which have hitherto been demonstrated in obsequiousness toward the German government and in shrewd political combination which follow the goal of contemporary Ukrainian reaction, instead of fighting it, not only preclude the possibility of participation in the Union by the UPSR, but make it the task of all party organs and members of the party to conduct a determined struggle against the influence of the Union on the toiling masses. The UPSR is deeply convinced that the Ukrainian people basically has nothing in common with the Ukrainian state. There is no difference whether it is a monarchy as today or a bourgeois republic, the dream of our national patriots. While struggling for social and political liberation, for the opportunity for a wide development of its national people's culture, the Proletariat of Ukraine, like every other proletariat under capitalism, has no country. It must simply win one for itself, and do this not in alliance with its national bourgeoisie, but in a fierce struggle against it, within the great worldwide struggle for the oppressed against the oppressors, for the destruction of the contemporary order and the establishment of socialism. The revised program of the UPSR Borot'bism had several new characteristics. First, it used as its argument the class struggle of the proletariat, and repeated the Marxist dictum that the proletariat has no country. This meant that the UPSR Borot'bism had shifted from its earlier populist, peasant-oriented platform to that of the Social Democrats, or more accurately by the fall of 1918, to that of the Communists. Second, to the conservative idea of the state, The new program opposed the revolutionary national idea. This was obviously not Marxism, which has a place for the state at one stage of social development. For the Borot'bists, the national idea at that time was by no means secondary, even though they made national liberation dependent on social liberation. They refused, however, to recognize the fact that, in addition to the problem of national liberation, there also existed the problem of national sovereignty. The third issue of Borot'ba, in October, continued the polemic against the Ukrainian democratic right on the occasion of the proclamation of the rights to self-determination announced by the Western powers. Under the historical conditions of life in Ukraine, the idea of national liberation was advanced simultaneously with the idea of social liberation. But in the course of the struggle, particularly in the most recent times, the Ukrainian socialist parties have made the problem of the national state the first item on their agenda. Supported by foreign circles and governments in their behind-the-scenes combinations to strengthen the Ukrainian Hetman state, they discredit and cynically profane the very idea of national liberation in the eyes of the toiling masses, forcing them into the clutches of those Russian left socialist parties which showed quite clearly during the revolution their lack of understanding of the national problem and their imperialist centralist chauvinism. The Borot'bists, as can be seen, were seriously concerned with the fate of the Ukrainian national revolution and feared that the Ukrainian right socialists, by their policy, would drive the Ukrainian masses into the Bolshevik camp. D. Movement of the Borot'bists toward the non-Bolshevik Soviet platform. 1. The Kharkiv Province Party Conference. Although the Borot'bist program just discussed was already far to the left, there developed under the Hetmanate an opposition faction within the UPSR Borot'bists which advocated an even more radical course. A group in the Kharkiv organization of the UPSR Borot'bists prompted a discussion of that section of the party platform which stated that the transfer of power to the councils of workers and peasants deputies is possible only for the short period of the revolutionary overturn, following which the function of government was to be delegated to a parliament through the Constituent Assembly. During the party conference in the Kharkiv province, held July 14 to 15, 1918, a group within the UPSR Borot'bists sharply attacked this point of view and advanced the slogan, "All power to the councils of toiling democracy." A resolution to that effect was rejected, whereupon the group withdrew from the party and issued the following statement. During the recent period of the revolution, the UPSR has compromised itself in the eyes of the toiling people, a fact which became especially evident after the October coup. In place of a coalition government, the October coup advanced the slogan of government by the toiling revolutionary democracy. The slogan was adopted by the Revolutionary Socialist Party of Russia, but it found support among only a few members of the UPSR. The position of the party as a whole until then was not clear. In fact, the right wing in the party overwhelmed the left. As a result, the Central Committee, as well as the Council of Ministers and the Central Rada, in which Ukrainian SRs participated, pursued a nationalist policy and rejected the toiling elements of Ukraine, leaving them to the Bolsheviks. This policy was stretched to the limit when the so-called UPSR concluded an alliance with the German imperialists in order to stifle socialist revolution in Ukraine. Since the formation of the Hetmanate, the UPSR of the left wing recently succeeded in dissolving the infamous leadership of the party and founded a new illegal party of reliable persons who hold firmly to the principle of revolutionary socialism. However, once again, the elected illegal Central Committee held to a non-revolutionary platform, having adopted the tactics of appeasement and coming out at this difficult hour of the revolution for the slogan of a constituent assembly, while the proletariat and the toiling peasantry of Russia are fighting for a government of Soviets. Because of the direction taken by the new Central Committee, some old members of the UPSR, traitors of the toiling people, rejoin the party, while members who stand for a government of Soviets are expelled from the party. We think, therefore, that the platform of the Central Committee, which recognizes the slogan of a constituent assembly as the only revolutionary slogan, is a platform of appeasement. In this difficult period for the revolution, it is necessary to stand on the principle of the class struggle and not to organize the toiling masses in parliamentary institutions in which the bourgeoisie as well as the toiling elements, will participate. We, Ukrainian SRs of the left wing, therefore deem it impossible to remain longer in the party. We leave the party which has advanced not along the road of revolutionary socialism, but along the road of the Russian right SRs and Mensheviks, the road of appeasement. This declaration shows the great influence of the Russian left SRs, which is not surprising in view of the fact that radical ideas from Soviet Russia were penetrating all the more into a Ukraine terrorized by occupation, in particular into the region bordering on Russia. 2. The August Conference of Party Emissaries. The differences within the UPSR Borot'bism were also manifest in the All-Ukrainian Conference of Party Emissaries held August 19 to 22, 1918. It was attended by party agents from the provinces of Kyiv, Podolye, Volyn, Kherson, Poltava, Kharkiv, and Chernigov, the chief representatives of the Central Committee for Internal, External, and Military Affairs, and the representative of the literary section of the Central Committee, and the secretary and all 14 members. The agenda for the conference included number 1, reports from local delegates, number 2, party organizations, number 3, party apparatus, number 4, party relations with other parties and trade unions, number 5, military organizations of the party and the relation to other sections of the party, number 6, party counterintelligence and its organizations, number 7, the next party congress, and number 8, current business. The agenda alone shows to what extent the Borot'bism had expanded their range of interests and strengthened their organizations since the 4th Congress of the UPSR. The conference devoted its attention primarily to a discussion of the question of whether the UPSR Borot'bism was a new party or the old UPSR regenerated. Blakitny, under the pseudonym Brat, argued that we have merely revived our old party, the UPSR, which was steered in an alien direction by our March guests, a reference to the mass influx of new members following the February Revolution of 1917. Lashkevich, using the pseudonym Baron, said that we are a new current in the old party. In 1919, Lashkevich was to leave the Borot'bism and go over to the Bolsheviks. In reality, the new UPSR was very different from the old UPSR, which after the Second Party Congress had expressed itself in favor of parliamentary democracy and a bourgeois revolution, relegating socialist revolution to the distant future. The debates on the class basis of the UPSR Borot'bism showed how far the party had departed from its recent past. Many of the speakers pointed to the necessity of expanding party work in the cities, even advocating that the urban proletariat should become the focal point of their attention. As one of the speakers using the pseudonym Otello put it, in reporting on party organizations and the party apparatus, we should conduct a broad and active campaign among the working class in order to combat the monopoly of influence which the Social Democrats and Bolsheviks have over the factory proletariat. Considerable attention was also given to the place of a national state in the socialist revolution and to the party's relations with the state-oriented Ukrainian socialist parties and to the Russian Bolsheviks and Russian left SRs. The majority held the view that the solution of the national problem was as important as that of the socio-economic problem. However, the national state as a mere slogan and as an end in itself was rejected. The position of all other Ukrainian parties was condemned as counter-revolutionary. At the same time, the conference voiced disapproval of the tactics of the Russian Bolsheviks and left SRs with respect to the national question, particularly the Ukrainian problem. Mojuk, possibly a pseudonym of Mikhailichenko, declared, "It is impossible for us to cooperate with the communists who set themselves against the socialists and represent a statist party fighting for the preservation of the Russian state, or with the Russian left SRs who follow the Bolsheviks." Blakitny argued that we cannot unite with these parties because they are communist, while we are socialist. Yet 18 months later, Blakitny was to become the most ardent advocate of union with the Bolsheviks. It is of course impossible to regard these pronouncements of the young Borot'bism as their definitive political views. Most of them were not yet 30. The important fact is that they had departed from their recent past and were looking to the future. Meanwhile, events in Ukraine moved rapidly. Disregarding the serious discontent, the Hetman regime became even more oppressive. The fines which peasants had to pay landowners were so arbitrary that the Austrian military forces refused to assist in their collection until the alleged damages had been supported by evidence. A congress of landowners and wealthy peasants meeting in Kiev in early November opposed the compulsory redistribution of land, arguing that it abolished the right of private ownership of property, the cornerstone of the very existence of the state. Faced with defeat in the West and the threat of internal revolution, official German policy began to favor a union of Ukraine with a non-Bolshevik Russia. Fedir A. Lizorov, Prime Minister of the Hetman government, in an interview with the newspaper Berliner Tageblatt, pointed to the Pereyaslav Treaty of 1654 as the ideal form of alliance between Ukraine and Russia. The Hetman government was forced to surrender Rostov-on-Don, Taganrog, and the Donetsk region to the White Don government. In consequence, resistance to the Hetman regime was intensified, and the National Union redoubled its efforts to persuade the Hetman to appoint a new pro-Ukrainian government. But following the outbreak of revolution in Germany on November 7, the White Russian ministers in the Hetman government insisted that the Ukrainian army be placed under the command of the Russian general Anton Denikin. When the Hetman issued the declaration announcing federation of Ukraine with Russia on November 14, the Ukrainian ministers resigned because the government banned a meeting of the National Union scheduled for November 17. Simultaneously, the National Union forming a new Ukrainian government, the Directory, called for a general uprising against the Hetmanate, in which both wings of the old UPSR played a prominent role. In the words of Mazepa, the Hetmanate was, on the whole, an artificial delaying of the revolutionary movement which reached the peak of its development toward the end of 1917 and the beginning of 1918. The peasants scarcely had time to take over the land from the landlords when a new regime began to give it all back. This was the main reason for the continued growth of the revolutionary spirit among the masses.